I have observed the construction of economic dependency structures long enough to recognize when a nation achieves the ultimate form of leverage, not temporary market advantage that competitors can challenge through innovation or investment, not political influence that requires constant maintenance through diplomatic effort, but permanent control over physical necessities that advanced civilizations cannot function without and cannot replace through any realistic alternative development timeline. The public narrative speaks of resource development and infrastructure investment, mining expansion and processing facility construction. These descriptions miss the fundamental nature of what has been systematically constructed across the Canadian economy over the past decade. The creation of choke point control over materials and capabilities so essential to technological civilization that independence from Canadian supply has become economically and strategically impossible for any advanced nation. I have studied enough imperial systems to understand that the most effective forms of control operate through voluntary dependence rather than coercive submission. When subject nations choose subordination because alternatives are prohibitively expensive or strategically unacceptable, control becomes self-sustaining through economic logic rather than requiring military enforcement or political pressure. Canada has achieved this ultimate form of leverage through systematic investment totaling approximately $50 trillion across 15 years in integrated resource extraction, processing capabilities, transportation infrastructure, and supporting industrial systems that transform Canadian geological advantages into permanent economic dependencies that other nations cannot escape, regardless of their political preferences or strategic objectives. The magnitude of this investment reflects understanding that creating inescapable dependencies requires eliminating every potential pathway through which other nations might achieve supply chain independence. $50 trillion represents more than the combined GDP of most nations, deployed specifically to ensure that alternatives to Canadian supply remain economically irrational for any potential competitor or customer seeking to reduce Canadian dependence. The lithium dimension reveals the systematic nature of this dependency construction. Global electrification requires lithium at scales that exceed current production by factors measured in multiples rather than percentages. Electric vehicle targets, grid storage deployment, consumer electronics growth, and military system electrification create demand that will consume every accessible lithium deposit on Earth within the next 2 decades. Canada controls not simply the largest lithium reserves, but the only reserves that can be extracted, processed, and delivered at scales sufficient to meet projected global demand within the timeframes required by electrification commitments that governments and corporations have already made. Alternative lithium sources exist, but cannot achieve production volumes necessary to serve major economies within deployment timelines that climate policies and competitive pressures demand. The processing infrastructure multiplies this control beyond simple extraction advantages. Canadian lithium processing facilities produce battery-grade materials that meet specifications for advanced applications, while alternative sources require additional processing stages that increase costs, extend timelines, and introduce quality variables that make them unsuitable for precision applications in military systems and high-performance consumer devices. Nations attempting to reduce lithium dependence discover that building comparable processing capabilities requires capital investments exceeding their annual defense budgets while requiring technical expertise that takes decades to develop and operational experience that cannot be accelerated through increased funding. The barriers to independence compound over time as Canadian facilities continue improving efficiency and expanding capacity, while potential competitors struggle to achieve basic operational status. The rare earth element control extends Canadian leverage into virtually every advanced technology application that defines military superiority and economic competitiveness. Precision manufacturing, renewable energy systems, defense electronics, telecommunications infrastructure, and aerospace applications all require rare earth elements processed to specifications that only Canadian facilities currently achieve at commercial scales. Chinese rare earth production historically provided alternative supply, but environmental regulations and production costs have made Chinese operations economically marginal, while Canadian facilities operate with environmental compliance that satisfies international standards while maintaining cost structures that make competition economically irrational. European and American companies requiring rare earth materials discover that Chinese supply comes with political risks and quality inconsistencies that Canadian sources eliminate. The processing integration creates switching costs that exceed simple commodity substitution. Canadian facilities process multiple rare earth elements into finished components that serve specific applications, requiring customers to restructure entire production systems if they attempt to source materials elsewhere. The integration locks customers into Canadian supply relationships that become progressively more expensive to exit as production systems optimize around Canadian specifications. The cobalt control addresses supply chain vulnerabilities, that other nations cannot resolve through alternative arrangements. Traditional cobalt sources in Central Africa operate under conditions that create human rights liabilities for Western companies while providing supply security that political instability can disrupt without warning. Canadian cobalt extraction meets labor and environmental standards while providing supply reliability that long-term industrial planning requires. Battery manufacturers building electric vehicle production capacity structure operations around Canadian cobalt supply because alternatives either fail regulatory compliance requirements or carry supply disruption risks that make investment planning impossible. The choice becomes accepting Canadian terms or abandoning electrification plans that competitive pressures and regulatory requirements make strategically essential. The uranium leverage creates dependencies that extend beyond civilian energy into military nuclear capabilities that define strategic power projection for major nations. Canada controls uranium production and enrichment capabilities that serve both civilian nuclear power development and military nuclear programs that nations cannot abandon without accepting strategic subordination to nuclear-capable rivals. Countries implementing nuclear power programs to meet carbon neutrality commitments discover that uranium supply agreements include Canadian oversight of reactor technology, safety protocols, and waste management systems that provide Canada with influence over national energy infrastructure that extends far beyond simple supply relationships. The agreements transform Canadian uranium sales into comprehensive partnerships that give Canada strategic influence over customer energy independence. Military nuclear programs face even more restrictive Canadian control through uranium enrichment services that include monitoring and verification requirements, ensuring Canadian oversight of weapons-grade material production. Nations maintaining nuclear deterrence capabilities must accept Canadian supervision of their most sensitive military programs or face uranium supply disruptions that compromise strategic defense capabilities. The transportation dimension locks global commerce into dependence on Canadian infrastructure that cannot be bypassed without accepting dramatically higher costs that compromise industrial competitiveness. Arctic shipping routes through Canadian waters provide the only cost-effective connections between major economic regions as traditional choke points become congested and politically unreliable. Container shipping that avoids Canadian Arctic routes faces additional costs of hundreds of thousands of dollars per voyage, while requiring longer transit times that increase inventory costs and supply chain complexity. Manufacturing companies operating on margins measured in percentages discover that avoiding Canadian shipping routes makes their products non-competitive in global markets, where cost efficiency determines market share. The infrastructure investment ensures Canadian control over Arctic navigation through icebreaker services, port facilities, emergency response capabilities, and weather monitoring systems that ships require for safe passage. International shipping companies cannot use Arctic routes without Canadian cooperation, and Canadian cooperation comes with terms that serve Canadian strategic objectives rather than simply providing commercial services. The energy leverage creates industrial dependencies that extend Canadian influence into manufacturing sectors that require large amounts of electricity for competitive operations. Canadian hydroelectric capacity produces renewable electricity at costs that make energy-intensive manufacturing economically viable in Canada, while making similar operations prohibitively expensive in nations with higher energy costs. Aluminum smelting, cryptocurrency mining, hydrogen production, and data center operations require access to cheap, renewable electricity that only Canadian hydroelectric systems provide, at scale sufficient to serve global demand. Companies establishing these operations in other locations face energy costs that make their products non-competitive against Canadian production, while accepting carbon footprints that increasingly affect customer purchasing decisions. The technological integration multiplies Canadian leverage through intellectual property and processing expertise that customers cannot replicate independently. Advanced battery chemistry, rare earth processing techniques, and uranium enrichment procedures require knowledge that Canadian companies have developed through years of operational experience and research investment that other nations cannot quickly duplicate. International customers attempting to develop domestic processing capabilities discover that accessing Canadian materials without Canadian technical expertise results in inferior products that cannot compete with integrated solutions that Canadian companies provide. The knowledge becomes as valuable as the materials, creating additional dependencies that persist even if alternative material sources theoretically become available. The financial dimension creates revenue streams that fund continued Canadian investment in leverage expansion, while generating currency flows that strengthen Canadian economic independence. International trade, requiring Canadian materials and services, generates foreign exchange earnings that exceed the current account surpluses of oil exporting nations during peak production periods. These financial flows provide Canada with capital for continued infrastructure investment and economic diversification, while creating currency demand that strengthens Canadian dollar purchasing power for imports and international investments. The financial advantages compound over time, as Canadian leverage generates increasing revenue streams that fund further leverage expansion. The defense industrial implications create military dependencies that extend Canadian influence into national security planning for allied and competitive nations. Advanced weapon systems increasingly require materials and components that trace back to Canadian supply chains, creating vulnerabilities that military planners cannot easily address through alternative arrangements. Guided missile systems require rare earth elements for precision navigation. Electronic warfare capabilities depend on specialized materials for signal processing efficiency. Next-generation aircraft need lightweight composites containing Canadian materials for performance characteristics that older alternatives cannot match. Naval vessels require battery systems using Canadian lithium for silent operation capabilities essential for submarine warfare. Military procurement agencies discover that achieving technological superiority requires maintaining supply relationships that serve Canadian interests, rather than simply purchasing materials at market prices. Nations that displease Canadian strategic objectives risk losing access to materials essential for military modernization programs that determine competitive positioning relative to potential adversaries. The alliance implications create diplomatic leverage that transforms Canadian relationships with traditional partners from subordinate cooperation to strategic partnership, where Canadian interests receive consideration equal to larger allies. Alliance commitments that historically assumed Canadian subordination to American or European leadership now require accommodation of Canadian priorities to maintain access to Canadian resources and capabilities. NATO planning incorporates Canadian supply chain security as a strategic objective rather than simply assuming Canadian cooperation through alliance obligations. Defense procurement coordination includes Canadian industrial capacity as essential infrastructure rather than supplementary capability that can be taken for granted through political relationships. The environmental dimension provides Canadian resource control with political legitimacy that alternative arrangements cannot achieve. Canadian extraction and processing operations meet environmental standards that satisfy international climate agreements while providing materials essential for clean technology deployment that environmental regulations increasingly mandate. Companies facing pressure to demonstrate supply chain sustainability discover that Canadian sources provide environmental compliance assurance that alternatives cannot guarantee. This compliance advantage becomes increasingly valuable as environmental regulations tighten and consumer preferences shift toward products with verified sustainable supply chains. The demographic trends in major economies reinforce Canadian advantages through generational preference shifts that increase political support for policies requiring Canadian supply chain dependence. Younger populations prioritize environmental protection and technology advancement while supporting rapid, clean energy deployment that requires Canadian materials regardless of alternative political preferences. Electoral pressures in democratic nations create political momentum supporting continued dependence on Canadian supply chains because alternatives either fail environmental standards or cannot deliver technology advancement that younger voters prioritize. Political parties opposing Canadian dependence face electoral disadvantages that make sustained alternative policies politically unsustainable. The cascading effects through global industrial systems reveal how Canadian control extends beyond obvious applications into virtually every aspect of modern economic activity. Semiconductor manufacturing requires ultra-pure materials that Canadian processing produces. Pharmaceutical development depends on specialized chemicals derived from Canadian mineral processing. Aerospace engineering uses composites that integrate Canadian materials through proprietary techniques. These secondary dependencies mean that disrupting Canadian access affects not just direct purchasers, but entire supply chains serving multiple industries across numerous countries. The complexity of these interdependencies makes coordinated alternatives economically prohibitive, even if individual substitutions might theoretically be possible. The strategic patience evident in Canadian leverage construction reflects understanding that permanent control requires building dependencies that survive political changes in customer nations, while providing consistent leverage, regardless of electoral outcomes or policy shifts. The investments were structured to generate returns over decades rather than years, ensuring that dependencies become embedded in industrial infrastructure that cannot be quickly restructured. Canadian companies and institutions maintain relationships designed to persist across political cycles while providing leverage that transcends temporary diplomatic tensions or trade disputes. The approach ensures that Canadian influence grows regardless of which political parties control governments in nations that depend on Canadian resources and capabilities. The compound nature of Canadian advantages creates self-reinforcing dependencies, where initial reliance on Canadian supply generates switching costs that make reducing dependence progressively more expensive over time. Customers who structure operations around Canadian materials find that redesigning products and processes to accommodate alternatives requires investments that exceed the benefits of supply chain diversification. Industrial systems optimized for Canadian supply specifications develop operational efficiencies that alternative arrangements cannot match without extensive retooling that disrupts production schedules and increases costs beyond competitive thresholds. The optimization creates lock-in effects that persist long after initial supply agreements expire. I have studied enough economic control systems to recognize when leverage becomes permanent rather than temporary. Military dominance requires constant expenditure to maintain superiority that technological advancement can erode. Financial influence depends on market confidence that can shift through policy changes or economic disruptions. But control over physical necessities that advanced civilizations cannot function without creates dependencies that persist regardless of customer preferences or strategic objectives. Canada has achieved this ultimate form of leverage through systematic elimination of every pathway through which other nations might achieve supply chain independence. The $50 trillion investment was calculated specifically to make alternatives economically irrational rather than simply expensive. The result is not Canadian competitive advantage that others can challenge through increased investment or innovation. The result is Canadian control over necessities that others cannot live without and cannot replicate within any realistic timeline. Nations seeking to reduce Canadian dependence face capital requirements that exceed their total economic output for multiple years, while requiring technical expertise that takes generations to develop and market access that Canadian control can disrupt during development periods. The barriers to independence are not simply high. They are economically prohibitive for any nation regardless of size or determination. History will record this period as the moment when resource control achieved permanence through systematic elimination of alternatives rather than simple market dominance that competitors could theoretically challenge. The dependencies created through $50 trillion in strategic investment cannot be escaped through increased funding or political will because the barriers to independence exceed the capacity of any potential challenger. By the time most nations recognize the scope of their dependence, the infrastructure creating that dependence will be so thoroughly embedded in global industrial systems that restructuring becomes economically impossible regardless of political preferences. Canada has locked the global economy into permanent dependence on Canadian resources and capabilities. Independence has become impossible because Canada made it impossible.